It does my heart good to see this large crowd. I really appreciate you all. I'm seeing folks who have been at our past several symposiums. Thank you for joining us. In addition to recognizing Ed as one of our distinguished alumni and to honor him in his vision as statesman during his years in Congress, this symposium serves to bolster public knowledge and engagement about world events. This parallels a recent survey by the AP NORC, otherwise known as Associated Press National Opinion Research Center, that showed 40% of Americans think foreign policy should be a top national priority. That's double the responses from 2022. We find ourselves at a pivotal juncture in history where geopolitical shifts are redefining the contours of international relations, particularly as it relates to our timely symposium theme. The keynote today by Congressman Royce will provide an overall backgrounder on the theme. Then we have secured a distinguished panel for this afternoon to provide their perspectives as we conduct the panel discussions. The brief bios of our speakers, panelists, and moderators are available in your program that's at your seat. One note, one of our panelists on China, Russia, Iran could not be here today due to a family emergency, so in their place, the team player that he is, Ed's going to join that panel, so don't miss it. Without significant donor support, this symposium would not be possible. The Planning Committee wishes to thank our sponsors, Brownstein, the Richard Nixon Foundation, Schools First Federal Credit Union, the Kyle House Group, and I also want to thank Paul Carter, our alumnus, for his support. We're also grateful to our promotional partners for their support too, Cal State Fullerton's College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the College of Business and Economics, the Orange County Forum, and the World Affairs Council, Orange County. At your seat, we'd like to know how you learned of the symposium, so there is a comment card that you can utilize your own device to respond via the QR code. We'd like to know how to reach you and how you learned about this, so please respond. Finally, I want to thank the many people who have had a role in planning and coordinating this program. In your program is a list of acknowledgments of those that made this symposium a reality. Particularly, I want to thank Ed and Marie for their support and for being here. I'd like to thank President Alva and her husband Sal for being here. I am especially grateful also that former President Virgie is here today. Julie could not make it. She is not feeling well today, but I'm especially grateful that Fram is here because the Royce International Symposium was officially launched in 2022 during Fran's presidency. Fram, thank you very much. I also want to thank Sophia Chang, Pia Claudio, and Sophia Darvish for event coordination. They are my saviors. And thanks to Schools First and alumna Margaret McCarthy to make student attendance complimentary. So we have a large number of students who are with us today. I also want to thank Mert Bayrachter and Quinn Boer. Where are you two? Raise your hands. Thank you very much for your help in corralling these student attendants. Thank you all for helping make this. And now, Marie, I'm going to call you up. Where are you, Marie? There you are. She reminded me when we were planning this that this is International Women's Day. So how fitting. It's Women's History Month, also International Women's Day today. So join me in welcoming Marie as she recognizes that special day. Marie.
First of all, it's an honor to be included, and I just want to say good morning to everyone. Today is International Women's Day, devoted to honoring women worldwide for their contributions. Invest in women, accelerate progress is this year's global theme. Here in the United States, women now comprise a majority of the American workforce. Women bolster our economy. In 2018, the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative was the first whole-of-government effort to advance women's economic empowerment internationally. In its inaugural year, the initiative made tremendous strides by connecting with 12 million women in development markets. This initiative was made possible by Congress's passage of the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act, authored by House Foreign Affairs Chairman Ed Royce. Let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you. So this day is especially significant to me, and as a result of that, 5 years ago on International Women's Day, I unveiled the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs program at the United States Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. I created the State Department program with my team and oversaw it as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs. It was launched in 26 initial countries, and it grew to 80 countries under my watch. And now there are over 100 countries. More than 25,000 women have created successful businesses from Africa to Latin America and in Asia. For example, in Malawi, alumna Chimwemwa Mulambwa launched a social enterprise to help survivors of gender-based violence stand up their own businesses. However, in parts of the world, such as in Afghanistan, women are now banned from outside work. Abuse is rampant in places where gender-based crimes such as child marriages are committed. Groups like Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are recruiting women and girls who have little choice or freedom. In Salafist-led communities in parts of West Africa, women are still being circumcised. This week's Wall Street Journal led with this headline: a 16-year-old killed by the Iranian regime had dreams of a normal life. Serena Esmailzadeh was beaten to death while protesting the hijab and the Islamic Republic. Within the first 5 months of the Iranian Women, Life, Freedom protests, police have imprisoned nearly 20,000 activists and protesters. The protests resulting in the police killing over 500 individuals. In Western China, ethnic Kazakh and Uyghur women are drudging in work camps and are being sterilized. I visited those who escaped into Kazakhstan. I heard their stories, and I helped them to speak out. The Chinese Communist Party is not merciful to such women. So today, as we celebrate International Women's Day, let us recognize the enormity of the task of achieving equality under the law for women in countries which exist without religious, personal, and political freedom. Thank you.
I am so pleased to introduce our president of Cal State Fullerton, Dr. Sylvia Alva, who took the charge of leading our university in August 2023, but really for her, it's a homecoming. She started at Cal State Fullerton as an assistant professor in health and human development, and very quickly showed herself to be such a strong advocate of students and a smart administrator that she was whisked into administrative positions, and now has served across the Cal State system as a dean at Northridge and the provost of Cal Poly Pomona, and then in the chancellor's office most recently as the executive vice chancellor of academic and student affairs. And through all these positions just has shown herself to be such an advocate for students. So I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Sylvia Alva to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jessica, thank you for that introduction. And let me also join Marie in really acknowledging the importance of today as International Women's Day. Earlier, I was on the campus and the Women's Leadership Program hosted a International Women's Day, and I'm wearing my white coat in honor of the suffragists who were so instrumental in helping us secure the right to vote. It's also my pleasure as the university president to really welcome all of you to this wonderful event and extend a special thanks to Ed and Marie, the third annual Royce International Symposium. Not only are they a power couple, they've just been really phenomenal partners with Cal State Fullerton. I met Ed in what I refer to as chapter 1 of my career. And over that period of time, I've had the opportunity to see firsthand the experience and the engagement that he has had in international relations. He's often invited to be keynote speakers and really a thought leader in these important spaces. The university community is deeply appreciative of the collaboration also with the Nixon Foundation, our sponsors and our partners, and you see them on the screen behind us. Join me in thanking the Royces and our partners and the Nixon Foundation for their support of this event. It really does brighten my day when I see our students shine, when I see them sharing their expertise, their knowledge with others. It's so much a part of that learning and discovery journey that our students are on. I'm especially proud of one of our students, Melody Castillo. I have the opportunity to see Melody each and every day because Melody is not only a graduate student at Cal State Fullerton, she works in the office of the president. And I will tell you, she is an intelligent, thoughtful, and gifted individual and an important part of our leadership team. So I want to thank not only Melanie, but all of our students for the time that they took to help strengthen and broaden today's conversation around these international relation topics that they presented earlier today. Join me in thanking them. I will share with you, as I think all of us know, that these kinds of experiences, the opportunity to speak publicly about your work, is really an important step in that journey of really sharing your knowledge, your expertise with others. And I look forward to seeing where their diplomacy skills, their research and thought process takes them. I'm particularly excited because as a university, we graduate around 11,000 students each year. And I'm especially proud as I go in about doing my work life, my personal life, to bump into proud Titans. And everywhere I go, I will tell you, not only is there a sense of pride in what they do, but it's also so evident to me that they are making a difference and moving into important leadership and innovative roles in our society. So really, so proud of them. I want to take an opportunity now to shift gears and introduce our keynote speaker, Ed Royce. In just a few minutes, we'll hear from him, and later our panelists will delve more deeply into the topics during our panel discussion that will focus on China, Russia, Africa, and Iran. But before I share some of his career highlights, I'd also like to start by sharing with you that Ed Royce is a distinguished Titan who has demonstrated not only his mastery of this work, but really an expansive alumni network and has been an important champion of our university. Ed, thank you so very much. Ed has had an impressive political career, and he has stepped into many times over the years to support Cal State Fullerton students. Let me share a little bit about his journey. He served in the House of Representatives for 26 years, representing California's 39th district and serving as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee from 2013 to 2019. While in Congress, Ed was a passionate advocate for Cal State Fullerton, assisting with funding for a variety of programs that supported our campus and community. Examples include the Ruby Gerontology Center, Childhood Obesity Prevention Research, a Math Science Initiative, the Asian Language Center, and our nursing program. Thank you. Thank you for that support. He was also a steadfast supporter of our Cal State DC Scholars Program, ensuring that our students had internship opportunities both in his local and in his DC offices. We are also grateful recipients of his official congressional papers that are housed in the Lawrence DeGraff Center for Oral and Public History. And last night, we had a beautiful event in support of that important center and its role in keeping the visibility of public servants alive here in Orange County. During his time in office, Ed was the consummate deal maker, crossing party lines to build bipartisan consensus and move legislation. Ed's leadership as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee advanced human rights, free and fair elections, economic development, women's empowerment, and security around the globe. He authored critical legislation to address threats from Iran, North Korea, and Russia, and modernized export control laws to maintain the United States' edge in emerging fields like robotics and artificial intelligence. These are many of the ways these contributed while in office, but I'd like to highlight one more. Ed also served as a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee. He was among the first to identify systemic risk in the housing finance system before the 2008 crisis and authored legislation to create a single strong regulator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This was a dark time for homeowners in our country, and Ed was at the table finding solutions. He does not shy away from serious work, and today's theme is another example. It is now my pleasure to invite one of our distinguished alumni to the lectern to provide a commentary on today's very timely topic of American foreign policy in a destabilized world. Ed.
President Oliver, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very kind. Thank you. Let me begin just by introducing another graduate at Cal State Fullerton, my sister Jennifer. I'm going to ask her and Kate, my niece, who are with us today. But I noticed out in the audience there are a number of people here who have been in the DC Scholars Program or who were part of what we called Team Royce, the staff that ran our office here or in DC. And if I could ask all of them to stand at this time, would you oblige me here? And thank you all. Thank you all for being here, and for each and every one of you, I really appreciate your attendance here for what is a rather interesting topic. And the idea of American foreign policy in a destabilized world with respect to China, Russia, Africa, and Iran sort of begs the question, what is destabilizing the world? What are creating these challenges that we see around the globe? What's behind it? And I think one of the interesting questions, especially from an academic perspective, is the old adage going back to early history, the struggle between democratic societies like Athens and totalitarian ones like Sparta. There is a tendency for authoritarian regimes, authoritarian governments, to expand into space where democratic societies have to deal with the consequences. And the most immediate destabilizing event that we've had to deal with was President Putin's meeting with President Xi on February 4th of 2022, where they came out of that meeting announcing several things, but the first thing was a strategic alliance with no limits between the two. And we wondered what exactly would that portend. And 20 days later, we found out with the attack, with a full throttle attack on Ukraine, a drive right to Kyiv. Now, although that effort was temporarily halted, clearly, as the alliance began to expand, and maybe we could put up a few of the, Owen, maybe we could put up a chart here or a graph, and maybe I can do that on my own. There we go. Thank you. The alliance quickly expanded some 7 months later to include Iran in this effort, and they joined the security arrangement between Beijing and Moscow, but in doing so, they began the process of sending drones and sending missiles to Russia to be launched against Ukraine. In addition, North Korea joined the alliance not long after with respect to sending 10 billion shells for artillery to be used against Ukraine. The consequences of this have been to destabilize the food supply, as was discussed in the last panel, that goes out of the breadbasket of Europe, which is Ukraine and that part of Russia, to feed Africa, to feed many parts of the Middle East. But it has also been to create a new attitude of a more serious aggression with respect to the way Putin talks and acts. And I don't know how many of you saw his interview where he was explaining World War II and specifically how Poland helped launch World War II by its resistance to annexation. How many here? So some of you saw that interview. The irony in that is that Poland was the focus of the beginning of the war, but the agreement, which he left unstated, was the pact between Hitler and Stalin to split Poland in half, and the fact that the Wehrmacht attacked from the west and the Red Army attacked from the east. And the fact that that act of aggression didn't end there, but that pact also gave Russia the right to attack Finland and take Finland and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, the eastern part of Europe, and it was by design, by their mutual agreement, that Germany would take Western Europe. Putin today is back speaking to this issue of these countries which were once part of Russia. And it is very clear that if Ukraine does fall, it will not be long before you see attacks on Moldova, on Georgia. Putin right now is claiming all of Central Asia, some 7 countries, should be again part of Greater Russia, and he's saying the same of the Baltic states, of Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia. At the same time, you also have, and let me move to just show you what I sort of view as the consequences. In blue, you see Great Britain, and you see the British Commonwealth at the time. From 1939, when Nazi Germany took what you see there of Western Europe and Western Africa, and you see Italy there, they took Greece and Albania and Eastern Africa. You see Japan and the fact that it was in the process of taking China and had taken Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and so forth. Not too long after this point in time in the map, the foreign minister, von Ribbentrop of Germany, would sit down with the Japanese high command and urge them to take out the Pacific Fleet. So about 5.5 months after this, on December 7th, was the attack on Pearl Harbor. By December 5th, Hitler had reversed himself with his alliance with Britain his alliance with the Soviet Union after 2 years, and had drove on Moscow and was 10.5 miles outside of Moscow, 2 days before Pearl Harbor. There was very little doubt in the Japanese imperial officers' minds that Moscow was going to fall. The problem with authoritarian regimes historically combining their forces to attack democratic states is that if the democratic states are not really working on deterrence, on a strategy for holding off the impulse of people who do not have any feedback loop to stop them, in a democratic society when there's an unpopular war, everything comes to bear in order to end that war. In an authoritarian dictatorship, when there is a war, everything comes together to force the further consequences of the whim of whoever's in charge, because the feedback loop is not going to stop that tendency that is human nature for people who have gotten that much power to try to further expand that power. So today, we have an alliance with no limits, a strategic one between Russia and China and Iran. For policymakers, the focus should be twofold. One should be, how do we create a greater deterrence? How do we try to hold together alliances with other democratic states? How do we speak forcefully for democracy in places where democracy is being undermined? That, as we found in the Second World War, can be absolutely vital to our survival. In the case of the Second World War, the one lucky consequence of Hitler's irrationality is that he didn't listen to his foreign minister, and he surprised him by attacking Moscow, driving towards Moscow. He was not supposed to do that, but he took that action. And as a consequence, we had an alliance of convenience with a state in the Soviet Union, with a government in the Soviet Union that originally had agreed with Hitler, let's first eliminate all the democracies. I think our first order of business is to find out how we can shore up other democracies, how we strengthen democracy. I think that as we look at the actions, for example, of Iran, and I'd like to speak to that for a minute, just in terms of what I believe may have been a blunder. I'm the author of the legislation against Russia, CASCA, when they went in to the first time into Ukraine for sanctions on Russia. And in that, I included sanctions on Iran because of their destabilizing actions in the Middle East and North Korea. Those passed both houses and were put into law. Since that time, those sanctions and others have been lifted. have been lifted or have been ignored. And the consequences of that is about $38 billion that has come into the coffers of Iran over the last few years. The last 3 years, that's about the sum of that money. During that period of time, Iran has spent $7 billion a year in the following ways. If you see Yemen to the south, you see where they helped the Houthis take over most of the country. The Houthis are the recipients of tens of millions of dollars, but also of Iranian drones and Iranian missiles. And you see the consequence right now of those drones and missiles, because they're taking out international shipping that otherwise would go through the Red Sea and through the Suez. And the consequences of that action is a lot of starvation, because it's not just cutting off the grain shipments out of Russia that's a problem. It's also the problem of getting food into these traditional markets, especially up through the Red Sea, and there's the destabilizing effect that this has. You'll also see in Iraq that hundreds of millions go to the Shiite militia there. That militia puts pressure on the government in Iraq to stay aligned, to be beholden on Tehran. The same thing happens with Syria, as you know, which is another ally of Iran now. Assad, his regime, receives $4 billion a year. In terms of Lebanon, Hezbollah receives $1 billion a year. In terms of Hamas, they receive $50 million. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad receives $70 million. That's to destabilize the Palestinian Authority. That's to keep these radical groups at the top of their game, and to have them destabilize the region, which is what Iran's ambition has been to do. I think the blunder was to lift those sanctions. I think that was a grave error, just as I think it would be an incredible blunder to stop the supply of ammunition going into Ukraine. And I say that because we have additional challenges that are being created by this destabilizing effect. So if we get back to what causes destabilization in the world, one of the things that does it is cutting off the flow of trade. The green lines that you see were the shipping from Europe to Asia and vice versa, that were previously going through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea. You'll notice that the green lines change to purple lines, where you have the increased traffic now because they're rerouting everything that went through near the Horn of Africa or up through that part of the Middle East. That is bad news for anybody on the map in that area, in that region, such as Jordan, etc., that relies upon food and commerce and economic activity. This is enforced by the Houthi attacks that are now, every other day on freighters that try to make that run through the Suez, and they've frankly given up trying to do it. In the meantime, again, Iran continues to pump out those missiles and those drones, not just for this purpose, not just for the Houthis, but also up to Russia so that they can carry out their war against Ukraine. These are the coups. When I spoke a little bit about the importance of supporting democratic governance, one of the things the United States tries to do with any number of different initiatives, including the BUILD Act, which sets up the Development Finance Corporation to help finance big industrial projects across Africa, and try to do it without the usurious interest rates that China charges. Allow our industry and our allies' industry to come in and help on these development projects across Africa. But all of this is predicated on working with democratic regimes. Now, in the area that you see up here, this is primarily Francophone Africa, with the exception of Sudan to the east, but the others are. These were areas where we had a real challenge with respect to Boko Haram, to ISIS, to affiliated organizations, and it was the French military with 5,200 troops in this area that were trying to keep the peace. A very clever campaign to destabilize that, launched by Russia along with the help from the Wagner forces, helped force the French out of this. How? Because they helped engineer coups. They helped engineer coups in each of these countries that brought dictators, military dictators, in place of the democratically elected governments. And as soon as they did that, guess who had new contracts for all the gold? The Wagner Group in these countries, and other minerals. And so this is sort of the contribution that Russia is making to destabilizing this region. But Russia is not the only contributor to the destabilization. Let me go here too to Russian mercenaries in Africa. This is Center for Strategic and International Studies, and shows, their machinations. They're not going to succeed in overturning all of these governments, but they are engaged there. They're engaged trying to get contracts, primarily for gold and other minerals. Now, the other issue that I am concerned about in terms of destabilization is something that Colin Powell was most worried about. Secretary Powell and I spent time in Africa and overseeing elections and trying to stabilize or support democratic states there. There was a constant messaging coming in from Beijing that there is an alternative system, and it's not one where you empower civil society, not one where you empower democratic governance. It's instead one where one person makes the decision, and as Powell would say, they'll say to a leader, we think that last election you held should be the last one. You should move to our system. We can help you. Our security people can help you. They can certainly help with Huawei in terms of their interconnectability, because they can listen into the conversations, and that's what you do if you got ZTE or Huawei. Beijing is listening into that. And same thing was true in South America, which is why Ecuador and other South American governments are trying to get rid of Huawei. These are ports that are going in across Africa. You see the placement of them. But it's one thing to build a port where you know what you're buying and you know what you're getting, and you know the interest rate. It's another thing when you sign paperwork put in front of you and you later find out that port could be ceded to Beijing, or that the interest rate you're paying is far in advance of what you could have gotten. One of the laws we changed, not myself, but the current chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee changed the law, so that now each of our embassies are sharing that information in every one of these countries. Because every one of these countries' governments, we know, are, again, getting this suggestion from Beijing. Do not think about freedom of the press or empowering civil society by having elections. Really listen to us. You want to close down the freedom of the press. You want to get that messaging so that it's stability behind you as the leader. And this, again, goes to the issue of whether we're going to have democratic states from Latin America to Southeast Asia to Africa, or whether we're going to allow that culture to be moved to an authoritarian model. This is external debt to China as a percentage of GDP. Again, I consider these interest rates usurious and these practices unconscionable in terms of the debt burden that's placed so often on these emerging markets. This is the last slide I have, but I just wanted to make the point because many people probably wonder, well, maybe Ukraine is just a one-off. Maybe Putin doesn't intend to march soldiers in if Ukraine were to collapse. What would he do with his army? Well, this is what he's already done with his army. I mean, you see the eastern border of Ukraine there, but you also see Georgia, you see South Ossetia, and you see Abkhazia. Those are Russian troops that occupy those areas. If I threw a map of Moldova up there, you'd see Transnistria in the east. Those are Russian troops that occupy Transnistria in Moldova. And frankly, you've got the longest border in the world up there between Russia and the states to the south of it, like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth, Azerbaijan. Those states are all at risk because he claims, or I should say in this case, the president of Russia, or former president of Russia, his allies claim that this is all on leased Russian land. Again, the necessity of us engaging allies around the world who share our values, who want to move in a democratic direction, is an imperative. And I'll just close with this thought and then go to questions. But the key point that I want to make is that if you want to stop the acceleration of aggression, it needs to stop with respect to Ukraine. You should not allow that to fall to Vladimir Putin, especially when he's blaming Poland for a war which Joe Stalin and Adolf Hitler started by partitioning Poland. So should we go to the questions?
Thank you. Ed, thank you so much for a wonderful overview, geostrategic overview of what's going on. I'm Richard Downey, the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And you started off by showing or talking about the dangers of Putin's vision for taking over countries, and you finished up, again, highlighting the danger of not trying to stop that. Could you talk a little bit about the isolationism that's going on, certainly in the Republican Party and also in part of the Democratic Party as well. But how do you see this playing out, given that the danger that you just outlined, and yet on our side, we see this great tendency to back away from trying to confront it? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the interesting part about that is that it's not something new. We saw it in the 1930s as well. My father wanted to be a journalist when he was in high school at Dorsey High School. And he told me about, he remembers the arguments he was in or the debates between whether the United States should support Britain with Lend-Lease. Should we give them the 50 destroyers? Should we sell them the airplanes? Or should we instead sit on the sidelines? He saw that as very much the same issue. And he also noticed that the Hitler-Stalin pact had a certain impact on some of his friends. His friends on the far left, who thought the Soviet experiment, might be a hopeful thing for the future, they were very reluctant to criticize what was happening in Europe in terms of the attacks on the democracies. Likewise, his friends on the extreme right, who really wanted kind of Fortress America, is the way they referred to it, they didn't want to talk about the long-term consequences of this either. But from his standpoint, what they were missing was the brutality of Adolf Hitler, the brutality of what we saw out of Mussolini and out of Tojo and what was happening in China, the brutality of the Japanese Imperial Army. He saw that firsthand. He was a forward observer, basically a spotter, up on the line from the Normandy campaign, day 20 he landed, and all the way through until near the end of the war at Dachau. After countless battles, they go in and lift the lid off a hill. And he went up with two friends of his who had a Jeep. They had a Jeep at their disposal. He had his brother's camera. He took photographs of what they saw when they opened the rail cars and the dead and the starving. Those are in the Museum of Tolerance. The reality is that we should not kid ourselves if we do not act as the arsenal of democracy and get the weaponry to those who are fighting against these trends. We stand a very real chance of lapsing back into what we've seen through history is a drive by autocratic people to try to seize power. And the other observation I would make were his words about what he saw there. He said, there might have been some excuse for those of us who had heard that Hitler was going to try to kill 6 million Jews. Mein Kampf. There might have been some excuse for us not believing that or seeing it or realizing it until we were confronted by it. But you have no excuse. Your generation has no excuse. You have an Ayatollah who says Israel is a one-bomb country. We're going to kill 6 million Jews. There is no difference between, and I'm just quoting him, there is no difference between those words by Adolf Hitler and the words by the Ayatollah. And whatever we thought when we were marching around Death to the Shah on the college campuses thinking we were making progress, I would say in the light of history, we weren't studying hard enough about who the opposition was and what their intention was. And now that we have a situation where we see that they signed off in Tehran on the October 7th attack in Israel, that is not an action meant to stabilize the situation. That's not an action meant to help the Palestinian Authority get some kind of grounding. Not when you're doing that and you're giving $70 million a year to Islamic Jihad in the region and $50 million to Hamas. You're trying to do exactly the opposite. You're trying to destabilize the societies so that you can drive towards your goals. And if the Ayatollah starts Friday prayers with death to America, death to Israel, I don't really believe it, but I'm kind of hoping he doesn't. I'm kind of hoping he's not believing what he's saying. And I do think we need to take this seriously. And so I think that with respect to this long trend of isolationism in the United States, unfortunately, every 85 years or so, something happens to give us an advance warning that authoritarians are moving. And if others want to fight to protect their societies, and their request to us is to send the ammunition, I can't for the life of me figure out why we wouldn't want to do that, because that's exactly how we should conduct these efforts.
Okay, we've got a question here. We've got room for about 2 more questions because we've got to get a student research award in here too.
What are some of the better methods to shore up our alliances and to build out new alliances? What do you think are some of the better methods to do that?
Yeah, unlike the hard left or the hard right, I'm a big fan of NATO. I think NATO, expanding NATO had to be expanded for a reason. Probably 20% of Finland was absorbed by Russia in the Second World War, at the end of the war. I think that their continued threats, the fact that they had conquered Russia, Russia had conquered Finland and had conquered Sweden in the past, and their assertions that that was part of their territory has obviously scared the hell out of the Nordic, states. And I think that Scandinavia, really wants to be part of a security built up there. And I think that that also probably helps Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. The problems in those societies is that a big portion, maybe 30% in two of those countries and 17 in the other one, of the population are in fact people that Stalin brought in from Russia to replace the people he exterminated. As you know, there were 10 million people were exterminated by Stalin over time, but he particularly focused on Ukraine and on those areas, and he brought people in, just as he did into Crimea. So given that reality, you really want to strengthen that belt. And you've got to strengthen Poland because from Putin's standpoint, they took Poland at the end of the war. All of Poland, not just half of it, they got it all. And from their standpoint, that was taken away from them. As he said, just remember his expression, the greatest disaster, the greatest catastrophe of this century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. To him, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East Bloc was the greatest catastrophe. Given that, let's continue to expand our alliances, and I would say the same thing with respect to Australia, India. You saw the Quad, the way that India and Australia are now working in tandem with Japan. South Korea has shown a real interest in doing more in terms of trying to protect the Pacific. Why would that be? Because Beijing, unfortunately, is claiming the South China and East China Sea right up to the borders, frankly, of Indonesia and the Philippines. They're claiming Taiwan, that they're going to take Taiwan, but South Korea, and even Vietnam. All of those areas, you have your exclusive economic zone, but Beijing is now coming in and taking that area and pushing. You saw the fights maybe a couple days ago between the water cannons on the Chinese ships aimed at the Philippine ships to try to push them out. These are islands right off the coasts of these countries. We have to keep these sea lanes open. It doesn't mean that we need to be belligerent with China, but what it does mean is that we need alliances with other people such as India. India lost, if you recall in history, China invaded Tibet, and after they invaded Tibet, they also invaded part of northern India and took part of Kashmir. And they never returned it, of course. So this is fresh in the minds of democratic states, and they're inclined to join alliances. Yes?
Thank you very much for very, very insightful overview. My name is Jan Keeley, and the question I have is, Ukraine is the most second corrupt country in Europe after Russia, and we're sending a lot of help and a lot of money. What kind of accountability we can have where they're spent it? Because in Ukraine, they just arrested 4 generals selling equipment and ammunition on the black market.
What we send is ammunition, primarily ammunition. And I think what you'll see Congress do is send the shells, the 155 millimeter shells that they aren't getting from they're getting a lot of them now from South Korea, and other kinds of armaments. In terms of the humanitarian aid, Poland, Germany are closer. Germany would rather send that kind of aid than weapons. So let Germany do more of that. There are audit programs that they've put in place, as you know. But I will tell you, having taken a team of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans into the Donbass, into the into Dnipropetrovsk, which is the area where the Russian-speaking people live, I thought in those meetings we were going to find them tell us that we want to be part of Russia. That's the language we speak. I just had, in every conversation, including the largest Jewish synagogue in Eastern Europe, every conversation we had in Dnipropetrovsk, the same answer. We have to stop the Russians. You've got to give us weapons to help us stop the Russians. They were all local militia. They were all filling sandbags. These were the women's groups. These were different ethnic groups. I didn't hear a Ukrainian accent. I just heard Russian accents. I finally found somebody with ties to the Russians. And I set up a meeting with him because he came over the border. And at the end of the meeting, he said to me, at the end of the day, we've got to figure out how we're going to get the Russians out of here. I wondered why did he say that to me? I later found out that for Luhansk and Donetsk, the 5 council members in each of those republics had been replaced by ethnic Russians. In other words, they can't even hold on to their own allies because the Russians are so brutal and so irrational and bureaucratic that people don't want them there. That doesn't mean they can't hold that area by force because their ruthlessness allows them to do it. But I think we let the Europeans do the humanitarian part. We do the hard armaments that they really need and need it now.
Ed, we got a question over here. We got room for just 2 more questions because we have a student research award.
Hi, thank you so much, Congress Royce, for the invitation to be here. My name is Professor Heidi Hart. I would love to hear more about your thoughts on Sweden and Finland joining. Do you imagine there are actually risks as well as maybe some positive consequences? You're someone who's spent a long time following the Russian playbook, and maybe you have a deeper sense of how Putin is thinking about these things. Or do you think that there will be very few consequences for that, from thinking about Russia's perspective on this?
Well,
Thank you.
you know, the observation I would make, and from Russia's perspective, you're only thinking about the perspective of one man now, because he calls the shots. This is now a dictatorship. I first met him when he was vice mayor of St. Petersburg. He was in Washington, D.C. I spent some time with him, took him over and showed him the train station, by the way. He wanted to see that. I talked with him about a number of issues. In my opinion, this guy is like a Bonaparte. If he has the opportunity, he will try to reconstitute Russia. It is very unfortunate that Sweden and Finland were once part of Russia, but they were. And so in his calculus, this is what they're looking at. And they've weighed this, and they've decided, look, at the end of the day, if these other societies, if continental Europe were to collapse, if Poland, if the Baltic states were to collapse, we're at more of a risk than if we draw the line now and say enough. Because if democracies don't stop authoritarian powers from these kinds of machinations and the impact that is creating across Africa and parts of the world without resources, they very much share our values in the sense that what Finland and Sweden would like to see is an expansion of democratic governance in the developing world. They see Putin stopping that. And so that's why they've made that decision. Marie and I have had conversations with the ambassadors of both countries. We know how passionately they feel about this. And that would be my observation. Yes?
Thank you so much for sharing your experience and wisdom with us here today. Given what you said about authoritarian dictators, excuse me, challenging our democracy and our need to strengthen our allies, I wonder how you might see both these authoritarian states and allies rating our presidential candidates and who they might favor and why.
I think what you might find is that they try to play in our elections. And one of the reasons we put sanctions on Russia was because of their machinations in foreign elections. So I think that one of the answers is for the United States to do more with respect to pushing back. And it's not just Russia, it's also Beijing, and it's also going to be Iran. And I don't expect them to change their conduct. But what I do think is a deeper awareness about their machinations around the rest of the world will help people understand their efforts to destabilize everywhere. It's just like Pearl Harbor. You might think you're going to be able to wait this out because who would be crazy enough to try to take out the Pacific Fleet? But don't discount that authoritarians talk to each other, just as Molotov talked to Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister. Just as the Soviets were talking to the Germans, the Italians were talking to all of them, and Japan, of course, as we now know, was in communication not only with the Soviets, but also with Ribbentrop, and had agreed to join the war against the United States. Again, deterrence and knowledge is the answer. So from my standpoint, up the sanctions against Iran, cut off their capability, as I showed you in that map earlier, to support malign actors. In every one of those cases, those militias, those Shia militias are there, or allied Hamas militias are there in order to try to push their agenda. So enforce the sanctions again and cut off trade in dual-use items. Those would be items that could be used for military purposes with respect to Beijing and certainly these other countries, and try to double down on reaching out to other democracies and assisting them through this. And I think as we grow and strengthen democratic states, that danger will be reduced. But I do not think isolationism is an answer, because I think the authoritarian regimes, each operating in different regions, could get a head of steam behind them. Right now, we've got the numbers, so let's keep it that way, and let's keep that focus on Ukraine. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Congressman Royce.